She was 72 years old, standing on a sidewalk in the November cold with everything she owned stuffed into one broken suitcase and two cardboard boxes held together with packing tape. The door behind her had just clicked shut. The door of the house where she had raised two children, buried a husband, and built 43 years of a life she believed was hers. Her own son had just told her, in the careful voice of a man who had rehearsed the words, that she had become a burden they could no longer sustain. 3 days later, Agnes Holloway would walk into a government auction with $22 in her coat pocket and bid on a property the county had already condemned and scheduled for demolition. They laughed at her. Every person in that room laughed. What none of them understood, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that the broken-down house at the end of Millstone Creek Road would turn out to hold something that historians have been searching for since before any of them were born. And Agnes Holloway, the woman her own children called a burden, was exactly the person destined to find it. This is not a story about a lucky woman. This is a story about what happens when you strip everything away from a person and discover they were never defined by any of it to begin with. Agnes had always believed that kindness was a currency that compounded over time, not in a naive way. She was not a woman who expected the universe to reward her simply for being good. She believed it more practically than that the love you pour into your children comes back to you, not as debt repayment, but as relationship, as history between people who have chosen each other across years of ordinary and difficult life. She had been wrong, or rather, she had been right about kindness, but wrong about the people she had chosen to give it to, which is a distinction that matters enormously and that took her 72 years to understand. Agnes Holloway had grown up in a small town outside Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a carpenter who had between them more books than money and more patience than ambition. She had studied literature at a state college, worked as an elementary school librarian for 11 years, met a civil engineer named George Holloway at a town planning meeting, married him at 31, and had two children in the following 4 years. David, now 46, and Carolyn, now 43. George died of pancreatic cancer 6 years ago. 18 months from diagnosis to the end. Agnes had nursed him through all of it. The surgeries, the treatments, the long, slow, terrible diminishment. And she had done it with a steadiness that George himself had marveled at in his final weeks. "You're stronger than you know," he had told her. "Promise me you'll remember that." She had promised. And then, in a way of grief, she had forgotten. The house in Concord, New Hampshire, was a colonial-style 3-bedroom on a quiet street that George had insisted on buying despite Agnes thinking it was more house than they needed. He had been right. The children had grown up with room to breathe. Agnes had filled the garden with the perennials she loved and the kitchen with the cooking smells that her own mother had used like a kind of domestic language. Roasted garlic, cinnamon, the particular sweetness of apple pies cooling on the counter on Sunday afternoons. When George died, the house passed to Agnes outright. He had made certain of that. His will was clear, and his lawyer had been meticulous. The house belonged to Agnes Holloway, free of any debt, to do with as she wished. 14 months after George's funeral, David had come to her with a suggestion. He framed it as practicality. He framed it as family solidarity. He framed it, most importantly, as what George would have wanted. "Mom, if anything happens to you, another medical emergency, a fall, anything, having the house still solely in your name creates a legal nightmare. Probate, delays, costs. If you add our names to the deed now, we could protect the asset. We protect you." Agnes had asked her accountant, a man she trusted, who said the estate planning logic was sound enough. She had asked her friend Barbara, who said it sounded like David was trying to help. She had not asked a lawyer, which would later seem like the only question that mattered. She signed the paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon in April. David thanked her warmly. Carolyn sent a text that said, "Smart move, Mom." Agnes made herself a cup of tea and felt, if not exactly grateful for the efficiency of the transaction, at least comfortable that her children were thinking about her future. She would think about that cup of tea a great deal in the months that followed. November 3rd came in gray and cold, the way New Hampshire Novembers often do, as if the sky has made a decision and sees no reason to apologize for it. Agnes was in the kitchen when she heard David's car in the driveway. She started a fresh pot of coffee and went to the window to wave, pleased that he had come without calling ahead. Carolyn's car pulled up behind us a moment later. They came in together. They sat together on one side of the living room sofa. They did not take off their coats. Agnes sat in the chair across from them, still holding her dishcloth, and understood before a word was spoken that this was not a visit. "Mom," David said, "we need to talk about the house." The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Agnes remembered it afterward not as a sequence of exchanges, but as a series of blows, each one delivered with a care that made it somehow worse than if they had simply been cruel. The house needed too much maintenance. The roof would need replacing within 2 years. The furnace was aging. The property taxes had increased again. Agnes's income, her Social Security of $1,200 monthly, plus the small pension from her years as a school librarian, was not sufficient to sustain the property long term. They had found a buyer, a developer who was offering $490,000. The closing could happen in 3 weeks. They had also found a facility, Pinecrest Senior Living, 20 minutes outside of Concord. A room with a shared bathroom, meals provided, activities, everything you need, Carolyn said, not meeting Agnes's eyes in one place. "The cost," Agnes said carefully, "is how much?" $3,200 monthly, David said. "But that comes out of the sale proceeds. We've structured it so there's a fund that covers about 10 years of costs. And after 10 years, a pause, we'll reassess." Agnes set the dishcloth down on the arm of her chair. "You're selling my house," she said. "It's our house," Carolyn said. Her voice had hardened in a way Agnes had heard once before, when Carolyn was 16 and had been caught in a lie and had decided that offense was the better defense. "You sign it over to us. We're making the decision that we feel is responsible for everyone." "You told me this was estate planning," Agnes said. "You told me nothing was changing except the paperwork." "Nothing did change," David said. "The house was always an asset. We're managing the asset. Managing the asset." Agnes repeated the phrase slowly. "I am living in this house. I have lived in this house for 37 years. Your father died in the bedroom upstairs. You are describing the management of an asset." "Mom," David's voice softened, but his expression didn't. "We're trying to help you. The house is too much for you to manage alone. You're 72 years old. These are practical realities." "I have managed this house alone for 6 years," Agnes said. "I have shoveled this driveway, paid these taxes, maintained this garden, and replaced the water heater entirely by myself. The first winter after your father died, when the pipes froze at 2 in the morning and you didn't answer your phone, I wrapped them myself with heat tape I found at the hardware store at 3 a.m. Well, have I asked either of you for help with this house?" "You call us all the time," Carolyn said, and there was something in her voice that Agnes had not heard before and could not quite name. "Every little thing that breaks. Every worry. You need someone to check on you. You become—" She stopped. "I become what?" Agnes asked quietly. "It's a lot," David said. "You're a lot. We have our own families. We have our own lives. We're not saying this to hurt you." "A burden," Agnes said. "You were going to say I've become a burden." Neither of her children answered. The buyer wanted the house empty by November 22nd. The facility required a deposit of $3,000 to hold her room, a deposit that would come from the sale proceeds, which Agnes would not have access to because the house was no longer legally hers. She asked if she could have some of the furniture. David said the staging company the real estate agent hired would handle the contents. She asked about the garden, the roses she had planted the spring after George's first surgery, the one she had tended through his illness as a way of keeping her hands busy and her mind from breaking. Carolyn said the staging would include professional landscaping. They left an hour later. They did not stay for the coffee Agnes had made. They did not offer to help her pack. They told her to be ready by the 22nd, kissed her briefly and without warmth, and drove away in their expensive separate cars. Agnes sat in her kitchen until the coffee was cold. Then she went upstairs to the bedroom, where George had died, and sat on the edge of their bed for a long time. She looked at his photograph on the nightstand. She thought about the promise she had made him. "You're stronger than you know. Promise me you'll remember that." "I'm trying, George," she said to the photograph. "I'm genuinely trying." Then she started to pack. She had less than she expected. 43 years in a house, and what she loved could be reduced to what would fit in a broken suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes. Clothes, photographs, the one of George on their wedding day, the one of her mother in the garden, the school pictures of the children from the years when they were still children. Her mother's copy of Jane Eyre, the spine repaired 3 times over decades. George's watch, a small watercolor she had bought at a craft fair in Maine the summer David was born, a painting of a harbor in fog that she had always found peaceful. The moving crew arrived at 8 o'clock on the morning of November 22nd, not to help Agnes move, to empty the house for the buyer's staging. 2 men with a truck who spoke to each other in low voices and looked at Agnes with the polite discomfort of people who understand they are participating in something they'd rather not examine too closely. By 10 o'clock, Agnes Holloway was standing on the sidewalk outside the house, where she had lived for 37 years with 1 broken suitcase, 2 cardboard boxes, and $49.73 in her purse. The cold was the kind that comes off the granite hills of New Hampshire in November, clean and absolute and entirely indifferent to human circumstances. Agnes pulled her coat tighter. The November sky was the color of old pewter. The street was empty except for the moving truck now pulling away from the curb. She looked at the house one more time. The wreath she had hung on the front door last November was still there, dried brown, forgotten by everyone, including her. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the end of the block. There was a newspaper on top of the recycling bin at the corner. She almost walked past it. Then something made her stop, pull it out, and stand there on the cold sidewalk reading the small announcements on the back page of the Merrimack County Gazette. County to auction tax delinquent and condemned properties. Minimum bid, $1. Auction to be held at Merrimack County Administration Building, November 22nd at 1 p.m. Agnes read the announcement twice. Then she looked at her suitcase. Then she looked at the $49 in her purse. Then she looked at the announcement again. If she was going to be without a home regardless, there was a certain mathematics to the situation that struck her as clarifying. She had $49.73. She had nowhere to go. The facility her children had found required a deposit she could not pay. The 3 local motels she had already called that morning were $50 a night minimum. And somewhere in this county, apparently, there were properties available for $1. Agnes picked up her boxes, put them under her arm, and began walking toward the county administration building. The basement conference room of the county building smelled of fluorescent lighting and old coffee. About 25 people were already there when Agnes arrived, dragging her suitcase down a linoleum staircase, carrying her boxes. They were mostly men in their 40s and 50s, the kind of men who showed up at county auctions with clipboards and the practiced confidence of people who had done this before and intended to profit from doing it again. A few of them glanced at her. Most looked away quickly. An elderly woman with a broken suitcase did not register as competition. The auctioneer was a thin man named Gerald Pierce. No relation to the president he mentioned, which suggested it had come up before, who had the rapid, efficient delivery of someone who found efficiency to be its own form of dignity. He moved through the first 21 properties quickly. Lots with foundation issues, commercial spaces with water damage, a former auto shop whose environmental contamination made it more liability than asset. The room bid on them with the enthusiasm of people who saw potential where others saw problems. Agnes sat in a folding chair in the back corner and learned how the process worked. She had $44 remaining after buying a cup of coffee from the machine in the hallway and paying 50 cents for a photocopied property list. She had studied the list carefully. Most of the properties had gone for thousands of dollars even at the first bid. There was one exception. Property number 22, 1,863 Millstone Creek Road, Calvert Township. Single-family dwelling, approximately 1,100 square feet, built circa 1863. Abandoned approximately 17 years. No functioning utilities. Extensive structural damage, including roof failure, foundation compromise, and severe mold. County inspector's recommendation: immediate demolition. Access via unpaved forestry road, impassable during winter months. Property sits on 3.1 acres of heavily forested land. At the bottom of the description, someone had added in handwriting, active wildlife habitation throughout structure. Enter at own risk. No one in the room was going to bid on that property. Gerald Pierce reached it at the end of the afternoon, after everyone had grown tired and several investors had already left. "All right, folks," he said, and his voice had acquired the particular quality of a man preparing to move past something unpleasant as quickly as possible. Property number 22, Millstone Creek Road, out in Calvert Township. Built in 1863. I'll be honest with you, this one's been on our condemned list for 4 years. The inspector's report uses words like catastrophic and irredeemable. We have a family of raccoons confirmed in the kitchen area, a roof that is more hole than roof, no electricity, no water, no septic system, no road access in winter, and 17 years of complete abandonment. The county's position is that demolition is the responsible outcome. However, we are legally required to offer it at auction before we can schedule demolition. So, $1. Who wants a house from 1863? Silence. Anybody? It's historical. Sort of. Laughter from the remaining investors. Come on, we've got raccoons included in the price. More laughter. $5, Agnes said from the back of the room. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This one had texture. Every head turned. Gerald Pierce looked toward the back of the room and found her. "I'm sorry, Mom." "Did you?" $5, Agnes repeated louder. "I'm bidding $5 for property number 22. For approximately 4 seconds, the room was completely still. Then it was not. The laughter was not the polite kind. It was the kind that comes from people who have decided that the funniest thing they have seen in recent memory is happening right now, and they want each other to know they agree. Several of the investors were openly grinning. One man actually said, out loud, "Lady, you're buying a raccoon motel." Another said something about good luck surviving a New Hampshire winter in a condemned building. A third, apparently feeling helpful, explained that the renovation costs alone would exceed $60,000, and that's before you deal with the mold. Agnes did not look at any of them. She was looking at Gerald Pierce. Pierce held up a hand for quiet. He looked at Agnes with the expression of a man who is deciding whether his professional responsibility requires him to save a person from themselves. "Ma'am," he said, "I want to make sure you understand what you're bidding on. This is a condemned structure. It has been condemned for 4 years. It has no utilities, no road access in winter, and the county recommendation is demolition." "Are you?" "Understand," Agnes said. $5 is my bid." Pierce looked around the room. "Anyone want to bid $6? Anyone?" He waited what seemed to Agnes like a very long time. No one moved. "Going once at $5, he said. "Going twice." He paused again. "Sold. Property number 22 to the woman in the back for $5. Agnes walked to the front of the room, opened her wallet, and counted out 5 single-dollar bills. She placed them on the table in front of Gerald Pierce. He stared at them for a moment. Then he pulled out the transfer paperwork. "Name?" he asked. "Agnes Holloway." As Pierce filled out the forms, a man approached her from the side. Younger, perhaps in his mid-40s, wearing a jacket that cost more than Agnes's monthly grocery bill. He spoke quietly, not unkindly. "Look, I don't know your situation, but that property is genuinely dangerous. The floor has rotted through in multiple places. I drove past it last year when the county sent out notices. The roof has a 4-foot hole in it. There's no heat, no water, no anything. You cannot live there. You will be hurt. Agnes turned to look at him directly. He had the expression of someone who believed he was doing a good thing and was mildly surprised to be required to do it. I appreciate your concern, she said. I'll manage. With what? Even a basic restoration would cost. I have everything I need, Agnes said quietly. It was not entirely true, but she said it with the conviction of a woman who had decided that conviction itself was a resource she was not going to run short of. The man stepped back. She turned back to the paperwork. Pierce handed her a large envelope. Inside, the deed to 1,863 Millstone Creek Road, Calvert Township, New Hampshire. Survey maps, property documents, and a hand-drawn map showing how to reach the property. Congratulations, Ms. Holloway, Pierce said. He didn't sound congratulatory. He sounded like a man who was not certain this was going to end well. You now own property number 22. Good luck. Thank you, Agnes said. She picked up her suitcase, tucked her boxes under her arm, and walked out of the county building while 23 real estate investors watched her go. She didn't look back. Getting to Millstone Creek Road on foot, with a broken suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes and $44, was the first practical problem Agnes had ever solved that required genuine ingenuity rather than the ordinary competence that life in a comfortable house had always required. She walked 3 miles to the eastern edge of Concord before her back told her the boxes were a problem. She found a gas station and asked the attendant, a young man named Jason who looked approximately 17, if she could leave 1 box in his dumpster and take only the most important items. He said yes, looking at her with the careful concern of someone not sure whether to call anyone. She consolidated her possessions into the suitcase and 1 box. Photographs, the watercolor George's watch, her mother's Jane Eyre, a change of clothes, her toiletries, and the small toolkit George had always kept in the kitchen drawer. A hammer, a flathead screwdriver, a Phillips, 2 sizes of pliers, and a utility knife. She was not sure why she kept the toolkit. She had never used most of those tools in her life. She kept it anyway. A mile further along the highway, a pickup truck slowed beside her. The driver was a woman in her 60s with the build of someone who had worked with her hands her whole life and the expression of someone who had long since stopped finding other people's decisions surprising. You headed somewhere specific? The woman asked through the open window. Millstone Creek Road, Agnes said. Out in Calvert Township. The woman looked at the suitcase. At the box. At Agnes. That's a long way out, she said. I know, Agnes said. I go near there, the woman said. Get in. Her name was Ruth Garrett, and she ran an orchard and small farm operation about 4 miles from the Millstone Creek turnoff. She had driven this road for 30 years and knew every property on it. When Agnes told her she had just bought the condemned house at the end of the creek road, Ruth was quiet for a long moment. You're the one who bid at the auction, Ruth said finally. Word travels fast in Calvert. Apparently, Agnes said. That house has been empty since old Lawrence Whitman died, Ruth said. Which was, well, it was before I moved here, so that's longer ago than I've been in the valley. Nobody ever tried to buy it. Most people didn't know it existed. What do you know about it? Agnes asked. Ruth was quiet for another moment. Only what people say. Lawrence Whitman was a recluse. Kept to himself. There were stories about the house having history. Something about whoever built it. Somebody important, but nobody ever paid much attention. The road's been impassable in winter for 20 years. No reason to go out there. She dropped Agnes at the turnoff to Millstone Creek Road as the afternoon light was beginning to go golden and thin. She gave Agnes a bottle of water, a flashlight, and, pressing them into Agnes's hand before she could refuse, 2 granola bars and a $20 bill. Neighbor tax, Ruth said when Agnes tried to return the money. We take care of each other out here. Come by the orchard when you're settled. I'll introduce you to people. Agnes stood at the turnoff and watched Ruth's truck disappear around a curve. Then she turned to face Millstone Creek Road. It was less a road than a memory of a road. 2 ruts through underbrush, overgrown with small aspens and the dark, resilient weeds of ground that has been left alone long enough to forget it was ever meant to accommodate human passage. The flashlight was necessary almost immediately as the tree canopy closed overhead. She walked for 20 minutes, suitcase dragging, box under one arm. Then the trees opened and she saw it. The house at 1863 Millstone Creek Road had been built in 1863. The same year, Agnes would later think that the country had been tearing itself apart 2 states south, and it had the solidity of something built by people who had no interest in impermanence. The walls were granite fieldstone, the kind of stone that glaciers had left everywhere in New England and that 19th century builders had used because it was available and because they intended their houses to outlast them. The roof had sagged and partially collapsed. Every window was broken or missing. The front doors stood at an angle, held by one hinge, creaking in the November wind. Vines had colonized the eastern wall so thoroughly they appeared structural. It was terrible. It was also, Agnes thought, remarkable. The bones of the thing were excellent. She could see that even in the dying light. She used her screwdriver to force the door properly open. She stepped inside. The smell hit her first. 17 years of moisture and abandonment, mold, and the sharp, particular scent of animals who had lived here without invitation or constraint. The floor was covered in debris, leaves, branches, animal nesting material, and things she chose not to examine closely. The ceiling showed water damage in patterns that mapped the history of every rainstorm since Lawrence Whitman had died. A wood stove in the corner had rusted to something that looked architectural rather than functional. From somewhere in what had been a kitchen, there was sound, rustling, the particular noise of creatures who had been here longer than Agnes and were of the opinion that this status entitled them to something. Agnes stood in the doorway of her new home for a long time. The flashlight made a small circle of light in the darkness. Outside, the November wind moved through the pine trees with the sound of something that had been there since before anyone was alive to give it a name. She thought about her children sitting on that sofa in their expensive coats. She thought about the word burden, which had been said in the careful tone of people who had practiced saying it and were relieved to finally say it out loud. She thought about George's watch in her pocket. Then she went to work. She spent 2 hours clearing a sleeping space in the main room, using a pine branch as a broom and her hands for everything else. Her hands had never done this kind of work. They would. She laid her coat on the cleanest section of floor and covered herself with a single blanket she had kept in her suitcase. She ate one granola bar slowly and drank water. She listened to the wind in the trees and the animals in the walls and the creaking of old wood making its case against winter. She was cold. Her back ached. Her hands were raw. She was also, for the first time in months, entirely in charge of her own circumstances. "All right," she said to the darkness, to George, to whatever it is people talk to when they're alone and frightened and determined. "Let's see what we're made of." She woke before dawn to cold that had entered her bones during the night like a quiet invader. Her breath was visible. She lay still for a moment, cataloging the aches, back, shoulders, hands, and then sat up and began the first day of building a life from $5. Water was the first problem. She spent the early morning hours exploring the property in the thin gray dawn light and found what she needed within 100 yards of the house. A creek running fast and clear along the lower boundary of the land, fed by the granite hills above. She could boil it or use the water purification tablets she added to her list of first necessities. Food was the second problem. Ruth Garrett's orchard was 4 miles away. The nearest town of any size was 6 miles. Agnes had $64, the original 44 plus Ruth's 20, and no vehicle and no prospects of income she could immediately identify. The house was the third problem and the most complex because, unlike water and food, which required only money and effort, the house required knowledge she did not have. Agnes had lived in houses her whole life. She had never built or repaired one. She began the way she had always approached problems that exceeded her immediate knowledge. She looked carefully at what was in front of her and asked herself what she already knew that applied. She knew, for instance, that buildings failed because moisture got into them. She knew that moisture got in through holes. She could identify holes. She could, with sufficient creativity, fill them. She had 17 years of forest materials available to her in every direction. Over the following weeks, she learned to weave pine branches into panels dense enough to stop wind and deflect rain. She learned to make a workable mortar from creek clay, wood ash, and dried grass, a technique she discovered by accident when she noticed that the original stone walls had been set with something that looked like mud and had lasted 160 years. She learned to split wood by watching a YouTube tutorial on the camp store's courtesy tablet, then practicing for 2 days until her hands stopped fighting the axe and started working with it. She learned that her body, which she had believed was simply aging, was in fact capable of rebuilding itself. The muscle she had not used in decades protested for the first 3 weeks, then quieted and strengthened. The calluses that formed on her palms did not feel like damage. They felt like armor. Ruth Guerra had told the truth about neighbors. Within a week of Agnes's arrival, Ruth stopped by with a kerosene lamp, a box of basic tools, and the direct matter-of-fact generosity of someone who has lived through hard winters and considers practical help to be a basic courtesy. She also mentioned that Nancy Cole, who ran Pine Ridge General Store and Post Office on the county road 5 miles east, was looking for help 3 mornings a week. Agnes walked to Pine Ridge General Store on a Thursday morning and introduced herself to Nancy Cole, who was stout and efficient and had the evaluating eyes of someone who had run a country store for 25 years and could gauge the reliability of a new face within 60 seconds. "You're the woman who bought the Whitman place," Nancy said. "I am," Agnes said. Nancy looked at Agnes's hands. The new calluses, the broken nails, the evidence of work. "You cleaned that place out?" "Working on it," Agnes said. "I'd like the job, if it's still available." Nancy studied her for another moment. 5 a.m. to 8 a.m., 3 days a week. $15 an hour cash. You be stocking, cleaning, whatever needs doing. I open at 8, so I need everything ready before then. "I'll be here Monday," Agnes said. "It's a 5-mile walk," Nancy observed. "I know," Agnes said. "I'll leave early." Nancy looked at her for one more moment. Then she reached under the counter and brought out a bag. Rice, dried beans, salt, matches, a large container of purification tablets, 2 cans of soup. "Advance on your first week," she said. "Don't argue with me." Agnes did not argue. 3 mornings a week, Agnes walked 5 miles in the dark along the county road to Pine Ridge General, worked for 3 hours, and walked 5 miles back. On the other days, she worked on the house from first light until she could no longer see. Slowly, week by week, the ruin began to answer her. The windows she sealed first, using her woven branch and clay mortar technique that she refined over multiple attempts until it held reliably against rain and wind. The roof she patched with layered pine boughs sealed with pine pitch, a technique she read about in an 1890s homesteading manual she found at the bottom of a trunk in the back room, a trunk she had not yet properly examined because the roof and windows had to come first. The wood stove she cleaned entirely, removing the rust-damaged sections and replacing them with carefully fitted stones she mortared in place. It took her 4 attempts to get the draw working properly, but on the 4th attempt, the fire caught cleanly and the smoke rose as it was supposed to, and the small space warmed within an hour. Agnes sat in front of it with a cup of boiled creek water flavored with a tea bag she had bought at Pine Ridge and felt something she had not expected to feel in a condemned house in the woods in November. She felt a home. By December, she had sealed the structure against the weather, established a reliable food supply, and turned the wood stove into something that kept the interior genuinely warm. Ruth had brought a proper cot mattress from her barn, insisting it was just taking up space. Nancy had given her, at the end of the 3rd week, a wool blanket, 2 cooking pots, and a cash bonus she called a rural relocation supplement. and refused to discuss further. Agnes had also started to pay attention to the house itself, not just as a survival problem, but as a place with its own history and character. The original construction was extraordinary for its period. The granite walls were 2 feet thick, fitted without mortar in the old colonial style, and then pointed with lime. The floor was wide plank pine, old-growth timber that had survived because of its quality, and beneath the grime and damage, it was still beautiful. The ceiling showed hand-hewn beams. Someone had built this place with the intention that it would last, and largely, despite everything, it had. In the back room, the room she had been using for storage because the floor was sound and the damage less severe, she began, in her 3rd week, to properly sort through what had been left behind. Lawrence Whitman had apparently been what the county records described him, a recluse. He had left behind the ordinary accumulations of a solitary life, old tools, broken furniture, decades of newspapers. But he had also left behind, pushed against the far wall and partially covered by a collapsed shelf, a wooden trunk. Agnes had noted the trunk from her first day and set it aside as a lower priority than survival. Now, in her 3rd week, with the house weathertight and the stove functional and her situation graduated from emergency to merely difficult, she opened it. Most of the contents were what she expected. Old clothing, a Bible with Whitman family names written on the flyleaf going back to the 1800s. A box of photographs, too water damaged to read. Newspaper clippings about local events from the 1960s and 70s. At the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in 2 layers of oilcloth that had dried to brittleness but held, was a flat wooden case approximately 2 feet by 3 feet. The case was locked, but the lock was a simple mechanism that had corroded open. Agnes lifted the lid. Inside the case, separated by sheets of thick archival paper that had yellowed but not deteriorated, were drawings. Not casual sketches. Not the ordinary illustrations of a hobbyist. These were botanical drawings of extraordinary precision and beauty. Plants rendered in fine ink and watercolor with the meticulous observational detail of a trained scientific illustrator. Each drawing was accompanied by handwritten notes in Latin and English, identifying species, noting locations and dates, and recording observations about medicinal and ecological properties. The handwriting was small, consistent, and clearly feminine. The drawings were dated. The earliest was August of 1864. The latest Agnes could find was June of 1878. She sat with the case open in her lap for a long time. Then she picked up the top drawing, a detailed illustration of a plant she did not recognize, with root structure shown, flower anatomy labeled, and a notation that read, "Found only on north-facing slope above the creek. Never documented in any flora of New England." Properties observed over 4-year period suggest significant anti-inflammatory action. Specimen preserved. Below this, in the same careful hand, EH, September 1866. Agnes turned over the drawing. On the back, in pencil, almost faded to invisibility, "These drawings are the work of 17 years. If you have found them, keep them safe. They're the truest work I have ever done. Eliza Hartwell, 1878. Eliza Hartwell. Agnes said the name aloud to the empty room. She thought, I know that name. She thought she knew the name from something she had read, or heard, or seen in a museum. She was not certain enough to act on the feeling. She spent the following week being careful with the drawings, handling them as little as possible, keeping them flat in the case with the oilcloth cover replaced, while she tried to remember why the name was familiar. It came to her on a Tuesday morning at Pine Ridge, when she was restocking the small local history section near the back of the store. There was a slim paperback there, published by the New Hampshire Historical Society, titled Lost Voices, Women of Science in 19th Century New England. Agnes had straightened that section a dozen times without paying attention to the individual titles. On this Tuesday, for reasons she could not explain, she opened it. Eliza Hartwell had her own chapter. She had been a botanist and naturalist, born in Concord, New Hampshire, in 1841, the daughter of a physician who had given her access to his library and encouraged her interest in natural science at a time when such encouragement for a daughter was exceptional. She had produced botanical illustrations for several academic publications in the 1860s and published a monograph on medicinal plants of the White Mountains in 1869 that had been well received by specialists and largely ignored by the broader scientific establishment, as was common for work produced by women of the period. She had moved to a remote property in Calvert Township, the Historical Society believed to study undocumented plant species, in approximately 1863, and had essentially disappeared from the record after that. Her later work, believed to represent the most significant of her career, had never been found. Historians of botanical science had periodically renewed interest in finding it. None had succeeded. Agnes sat in the back of Pine Ridge General Store with a pamphlet in her hands for 15 minutes. Then she put it back on the shelf, bought it with her own money, and walked the 5 miles home thinking. She told Ruth about the drawings that Saturday. Ruth drove out to Millstone Creek Road and looked at them in silence for a long time. "You need to talk to someone at the college," Ruth said finally. "I don't have any credentials," Agnes said. "I'm a retired school librarian living in a condemned house. Who's going to take me seriously?" Ruth looked at her with the expression Agnes had come to recognize as Ruth's version of decisive. "I know someone at Plymouth State who studies women in 19th century New England history. Her name is Dr. Helen Marsh. She came to my orchard 2 falls ago for a field study with her students. She's serious and she's honest, and she will not try to take advantage of you. If these drawings are what you think they are, she will know." Agnes looked at the case, at the careful lines of Eliza Hartwell's work. At 17 years of observation and documentation hidden in a wooden trunk in a house the county had condemned as worthless. "Tell her to come to the house," Agnes said. "I'm not taking these anywhere." Dr. Helen Marsh arrived on a Friday afternoon in early January, driving a 12-year-old Subaru that was more mud than paint and carrying a bag so full of reference materials that it listed to one side. She was in her early 50s, with the particular energy of a person who had found their exact right work in the world and was always slightly impatient to get back to it. She sat at Agnes's makeshift table, a plank across 2 sawhorses, which was all Agnes had, and opened the case, and for approximately 10 minutes, she said nothing at all. Then she said several things in rapid succession that included the phrases, "This is not possible," 17 years of undescribed specimens, the medicinal documentation alone, and "Do you have any idea what this is?" "I think I have some idea," Agnes said. "I'd like to hear your assessment." Dr. Marsh spent the next 90 minutes explaining, with the thoroughness of an academic who considers incomplete explanation to be a form of dishonesty. Eliza Hartwell, she said, had been recognized by the small community of historians who studied 19th century women scientists as a figure of extraordinary potential whose later work had always been assumed lost. The 1869 monograph had shown observational skills comparable to the leading naturalists of her period. The later work that historians speculated about had been understood to involve new species documentation in what Hartwell's surviving letters described as a systematic study of medicinal properties that modern medicine has not yet explored. If the drawings Agnes had found were authentic, and Dr. Marsh was already fairly certain they would represent one of the most significant recoveries of 19th century scientific material in New England history. The botanical specimens alone, Dr. Marsh said, looking at the careful documentation of plants and species and location notes, could be invaluable to current ecological research. Some of these appear to be species that have disappeared from New Hampshire entirely. Having documentation from 1864 provides baseline data we simply don't have. What happens now? Agnes asked. Authentication, first. I'd like to bring in a colleague from the botany department and a specialist in 19th century manuscript materials. With your permission. Nothing leaves this house without your explicit consent. My explicit consent in writing, Agnes said. Dr. Marsh looked at her with what appeared to be respect. Absolutely. You own this property. Everything in it belongs to you. Anything we do happens on your terms. Agnes looked at the case, at Eliza Hartwell's careful work, at 17 years of a woman's life, preserved in oilcloth in a wooden trunk for 145 years, waiting. She was here, Agnes said. She built this house, or she moved into it, and she spent 17 years working in these woods, and the world forgot her completely. Not even forgot, never knew. She did the work and got nothing for it. No, Dr. Marsh said quietly. She got this. She gestured at the drawings. She got the work itself. And now you've found it. Agnes was quiet for a moment. She left a note, she said, on the back of the top drawing. She said she hoped whoever found them would keep them safe. Will you? Yes, Agnes said. I will. The authentication process took 6 weeks. Dr. Marsh brought 2 colleagues, a botanist named Dr. James Hollister from the University of New Hampshire and a manuscript specialist named Dr. Ruth Delaney from Dartmouth, who examined the drawings, the paper, the ink, the handwriting, and the botanical content with a methodical focus of people for whom proof and precision are professional obligations. Their conclusion, delivered in a formal letter to Agnes in February, was unambiguous. The drawings were authentic Hartwell work. The paper and ink were consistent with the 1860s through 1870s period. The botanical content included documentation of 14 species not recorded in any known flora of the period and 3 species now believed extinct in New Hampshire, with specimen notes detailed enough to inform current climate change research. The medicinal observations, while requiring modern validation, were sophisticated enough to be worth serious pharmaceutical attention. The collection, as a whole, was described as a discovery of major significance for the history of American science and for the scientific understanding of 19th century New England ecology. The house at 1863 Millstone Creek Road, they additionally noted, appeared to be the specific location Hartwell had referenced in her surviving letters as her study station in the northern forest. If confirmed, and the carved initials they found on a ceiling beam, EH 1863, suggested confirmation. The structure itself was historically significant and should be considered for preservation rather than demolition. The county agreed. In March, the property was formally listed on the New Hampshire Register of Historic Places. With that listing came grant eligibility, not enormous sums, but real ones. Enough to address the structural work the house needed. Enough to install basic utilities while maintaining the historical character of the building. Enough to transform what Agnes had made survivable into something genuinely livable. The work began in April. Local contractors from Calvert Township, people Ruth Garrett had known for decades, came with the respect that New Hampshire people give to old stone buildings and the additional respect they gave to a 72-year-old woman who had spent a winter in it. They replaced the roof with period-appropriate wooden shingles. They repointed the stone walls. They restored the wide-plank pine floor to something that glowed. They installed plumbing and electricity hidden carefully within the structure to preserve its character. They built a proper bedroom and a workspace where Agnes could study Hartwell's materials and receive the researchers who were already beginning to request visits. Agnes kept her woven branch window panels in the spare room, mounted on the wall. She kept her pine branch broom leaning in the corner by the door. She kept George's watch on the small shelf by her bed, and her mother's Jane Eyre on the desk, and the watercolor of the foggy harbor above the fireplace. The wood stove she kept, repaired properly now, in working order. She kept every part of it. On November 15th, exactly 1 year after she had stood on the sidewalk in Concord with a broken suitcase and $49, Agnes Holloway sat on the stone step outside her front door in the thin November sunlight and looked at what she had built. The house stood whole and sound in its clearing. The granite walls had been cleaned, and the original stone glowed in the November light with the particular dignity of materials that had survived a great deal. The roof was solid. The windows had glass. The small garden she had started in late spring, mostly herbs and the winter vegetables she had learned from Ruth, with 2 rose bushes she had planted in October as a gift to herself, was asleep for the season but alive. She had a stipend from Plymouth State University for her work as the official caretaker and research liaison for the Hartwell collection. Combined with her Social Security, now forwarded to her new address, and her continued 3 mornings a week at Pine Ridge General, which she kept because she liked it and because Nancy Cole had become someone she considered a genuine friend. She had more financial security than she had had in years. She had Ruth Garrett, who came by twice a week with vegetables from the root cellar and conversation about everything and nothing in the warm, practical way of friends who have known each other through difficulty. She had Nancy Cole, who had lent Agnes money in December with no paperwork and no discussion and had never mentioned it since. She had Dr. Helen Marsh, who visited monthly and with whom Agnes had developed the particular friendship of 2 women who have found something important together and want to understand it fully. She had a community in Calvert Township, people who left things at the end of her road when they had surplus, who stopped to check on her in heavy weather, who had appeared one Saturday in March with no announcement and spent the day helping clear the winter damage from her road. She had, she thought, built something she had not known she needed, a life that was entirely her own, valued by people who had chosen to value it on ground she had earned with her own work. She was thinking about all of this when she heard the car. She knew the car. It was David's, a black SUV, expensive, the kind with a sound system she had never understood the need for. It pulled into the clearing and stopped. David got out. Carolyn got out from the other side. They looked around the clearing with expressions Agnes could read clearly from where she sat. Surprise. Recalculation. The look of people who have been expecting one thing and are being given another. Agnes stood. She did not go toward them. She waited. They walked across the clearing slowly, the way people walk when they are not certain of their welcome. David was wearing a coat Agnes recognized as new. Carolyn was looking at the stone walls, the new roof, the historical marker near the road that said, Hartwell Cottage, circa 1863, New Hampshire Register of Historic Places. Mom, David said when they were close enough. David, Agnes said. Carolyn. They stood in the clearing. The November light was the same pewter gray it had been a year ago. The pine trees moved in the same way. Agnes was different. We heard, Carolyn said, about the historical discovery. It's been in the papers. The Hartwell collection. It has, Agnes agreed. It's an incredible story, David said. He had the look of a man trying to find his footing and not finding it quickly. The drawings, the historical significance. We had no idea. You had no idea about a lot of things, Agnes said quietly. That turned out to be instructive for everyone. Another silence. The wind moved through the pines. Mom, David said. We came to apologize. Agnes looked at him, at his face, which was her son's face, which she had watched change from an infant's to a child's to a man's over 46 years. She looked at Carolyn, who was looking at the ground with the expression of someone who is carrying something they have been carrying for a year and are not sure how to set it down. Tell me what you're apologizing for, Agnes said. I want to understand what you think happened. David took a breath. We were wrong about how we handled things last year. We made a decision about your future without talking to you properly. We treated the house like an asset instead of your home. He stopped. I said things about you being a burden. I said it, and I didn't take it back, and that was wrong. It was wrong, Agnes agreed. I've thought about it a lot, Carolyn said, looking up. Her voice was unsteady. I've thought about what it must have been like to come home and find us there like that, to be told to pack and leave, to be left on a, she stopped, swallowed. I've thought about it, and I don't know how to live with it except to say that I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry, not for what we lost, for what we did to you. Agnes was quiet for a moment. She looked at the house. Her house, Eliza Hartwell's house, the house she had sealed against weather with her own hands and her own creek clay. She thought about something she had read in Hartwell's journals, a passage she had copied out and kept in her desk. The measure of a life is not what others were willing to see in it. It is what the person living it was willing to build. Come inside, Agnes said. I'll make tea. They sat at Agnes's table, a real table now, solid oak, bought from a carpenter in Calvert Township, and drank tea and said difficult things with the imperfect honesty of people who have hurt each other and know it, and are deciding whether the relationship is worth the work of repair. Agnes did not pretend the year had not happened. She did not erase what had been said in her living room 11 months ago. She told them, clearly and without excess anger, what the year had cost her and what it had given her. She told them about sleeping on the floor in November, about walking 5 miles in the dark at 4 in the morning to get to Nancy's store, about the cold that had been absolute and the determination that had been, to her own surprise, equally absolute. She told them about finding the drawings, about Eliza Hartwell working alone in this house for 17 years, documenting her work with meticulous precision and leaving a note that said, "Keep them safe," about what it meant to discover that the worthless thing everyone laughed at was actually priceless, and that the knowledge of that required no one's validation but your own. She was invisible, Agnes said, the way I was invisible. The way a lot of women of a certain age become invisible to the people around them. Not maliciously, just people stop seeing you. They see a category. They see a liability. They stop seeing the person. David said nothing. He was looking at the framed drawing above Agnes's desk, a reproduction of one of Hartwell's botanical illustrations, a plant Agnes had later identified as a species now extinct in New Hampshire. I didn't see you, he said finally. I saw a problem to be managed. And I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. But I'm genuinely, actually sorry. I know you are, Agnes said. I believe you. Are we? Carolyn hesitated. Is anything left? For us, I mean, as a family. Agnes looked at them, at her children, who had done something that could not be undone, but who were here in her kitchen being honest about it, which was more than she had expected from them, and which meant something. I don't know yet, she said. I think that depends on what kind of family we want to be. Not the one we were. That one wasn't working for any of us, though we didn't all know it. Something different. Something more honest. I'd like that, David said. I'd really like that. Then let's try, Agnes said, slowly, with honesty. No pretending things are fine that aren't. No managing each other. Okay, Carolyn said. She was crying now, quietly, the way adults cry when they're not performing it. Okay, yes. Agnes refilled their tea. Outside, the November wind moved through the pines with its deep, familiar sound. The house held its warmth against the cold the way it had been built to do, the way Agnes had repaired it to do, the way it would continue to do long after all of them were gone. On a Saturday in February, Dr. Helen Marsh drove out to Millstone Creek Road with a package under her arm, and Ruth Garrett came from the orchard, and Nancy Cole, Clothespine Ridge General, an hour early. They sat in Agnes's main room around the wood stove with tea and the apple cake Ruth had brought, and Dr. Marsh put the package on the table. Inside was a published monograph, freshly printed, its cover showing one of Eliza Hartwell's botanical drawings in careful reproduction. The title read, Recovered Voices, the Hartwell Botanical Collection, 1864 to 1878. Edited by Dr. Helen Marsh, Plymouth State University. With an introduction by Agnes R. Holloway, curator, Hartwell Cottage Historical Site, Calvert Township, New Hampshire. Agnes turned to the introduction. It was her own words, the essay she had written over the winter, sitting at her desk in the evenings by the light of the lamp, try to explain what it meant to find a woman's life's work in a wooden trunk, and what it meant that the work had survived when the recognition had not. Eliza Hartwell built her life around careful attention. The essay began. She looked at things other people had looked past, and she wrote down what she saw. She did this for 17 years in a house that most people did not know existed. And when she was done, she sealed her work in oilcloth and trusted that someone would eventually find it. I do not know whether she believed she would be remembered. I suspect she understood that the work mattered more than the remembering. What I know is this. She was right to trust. The work survived, and the house she built it in, which the county had scheduled for demolition, still stands. Agnes set the monograph down. She looked at the women in her house, Ruth with her farmer's hands, Nancy with her store owner's practicality, Helen with her scholar's precision. She looked at the fire in the stove she had repaired herself from stone. She looked at the window light falling across Eliza Hartwell's drawings on her wall. She thought about a year ago, the pewter sky, the moving truck, the word burden hanging in the cold air like a verdict. She thought about what she had found on the other side of it. "I want to read you something," she said. She picked up Hartwell's journal, the last one from 1878, and turned to the final entry. She had read it many times. She read it now for her friends. "I have lived in this place for 15 years," Hartwell had written, "and I have learned more in this forest than I could have learned in any library or laboratory. I have learned that the world is more intricate and more generous than we give it credit for. That the things which seem worthless to one, I may be priceless to another. That patience, which is not the same as passivity, is one of the great scientific instruments. I have not been recognized. I have not been published or celebrated or included in the conversations that my work warrants. I have been invisible, as women of my kind are made invisible as a matter of course. But I have done the work. The work is real. The work is here. And I trust. I choose to trust because the alternative is despair, and I am not a despairing person. That one day, someone will find it and understand what it was for." Agnes closed the journal. "She was talking to us," she said. "All of us, I think." She was saying, "The work you do in invisible places is still real. The life you build when no one is watching still matters. You're not diminished by what other people fail to see in you." The room was quiet for a moment. "That's what this house taught me," Agnes said. "I thought I was buying $5 worth of shelter. I was actually being given the chance to find out what I was made of, and to find the work of a woman who deserved to be remembered, and to understand that the things other people dismiss as worthless are often the most important things of all." Ruth set down her tea. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think the house picked you." Agnes laughed. "I think I was the only one willing to pay $5 for it." "That too," Ruth said. "But still." Agnes Holloway's birthday fell in March. She turned 73 in her kitchen in Calvert Township with Ruth and Nancy and Helen and 4 researchers who had come to study the Hartwell collection and had been adopted into the household in the way that the households of people with large hearts and small rooms tend to absorb people. David and Carolyn came too. They had been coming on Sunday afternoons since November, slowly, with the careful tentativeness of people trying to build something new on a foundation that they themselves had damaged and were now working earnestly to repair. Agnes had watched them over the winter months. She had watched David learn to listen instead of manage. She had watched Carolyn sit quietly in the house and look at the drawings and the stone walls with an expression that suggested she was understanding, perhaps for the first time, what it meant that her mother had done this. At one point, Carolyn had asked to see the room where Agnes had slept that first night. The corner of the main room where she had laid her coat on the floor and covered herself with one blanket and looked up at the hole in the roof through a tarp she had strung herself. Agnes showed her. Carolyn stood in that corner for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "I didn't know who you were." She said it simply, without defense or excuse. "I thought I did. I thought I knew who my mother was. But I didn't know this." She gestured at the room, at the house, at the whole accumulated, improbable reality of Agnes's year. "I didn't know you were this person." "I didn't either," Agnes said. "That's rather the point." At the birthday gathering in March, Dr. Marsh made a small speech about the progress of the Hartwell research. 3 academic papers already in progress. A partnership with UNH's botany department to study Hartwell's extinct species documentation, growing interest from climate scientists. She talked about what it meant, scientifically and historically, to recover a lost voice. She said some generous things about Agnes that Agnes accepted with the composure of someone who has learned to receive acknowledgement without either deflecting it or depending on it. Then Ruth stood up and said, with the bluntness of a woman who runs an orchard and has no patience for unnecessary sentiment, I just want to say that the best thing about this year is that a person I'm proud to know did something I could not have done. And that because she did it, something worthwhile exists that didn't exist before. And I'm glad she came to this valley. I'm glad she's our neighbor. I'm glad she stayed. Agnes looked at the faces around her table, at the people who had chosen her, not because she was useful to them or convenient, not because obligation required it, but because they had seen who she was and decided that mattered. She thought, this is what George was telling me. Not that I would be looked after, that I was strong enough not to need to be. Thank you, she said. To all of them for all of it. Thank you. On quiet evenings in the late spring and summer that followed, Agnes would walk the property, through the 3 acres of forest that Hartwell had walked for 17 years, noting the same creek, the same north-facing slopes, the same light through the same species of trees that had grown and died and seeded and grown again. She would look for the plants Hartwell had documented, and sometimes she would find something that might be a descendant of one, and she would make careful notes in the journal she had started keeping, not with any scientific pretension, but with the same impulse she recognized in Hartwell, the desire to pay attention to what was actually here rather than to what you had expected or feared. She thought sometimes about her children and the year that had broken something between them, and whether it was repairing properly or only repairing in the way of old bones, which heal but leave a record of the fracture. She thought it was probably both. She was willing to live with both. She thought about the word burden, which had been said to her on a November morning in a house she had loved and which had been taken from her. She had once believed that word was about weight, that you could become too heavy for the people around you to carry. She understood now that it was actually about visibility. When you are seen clearly as a full and complex person, you are never a burden, you are a presence. It is only when people have stopped seeing you that you become, in their eyes, a weight without a face. The solution to being called a burden is not to make yourself lighter. It is to insist on being seen. Eliza Hartwell had understood that. She had not made herself lighter. She had done her work and sealed it in oilcloth and trusted that the seeing would eventually come. It had. Agnes walked the creek path on an evening in late June, when the forest was full of the particular green light of New England summer, layered and deep, the light of a place that takes 6 months to arrive at this abundance and intends to spend it generously. She could hear the creek over the stone. She could hear, faintly, a wood thrush somewhere in the maples above. She stopped at the north-facing slope where Hartwell's journals indicated her most significant undescribed species had been found. She looked at the vegetation carefully, the way she had been learning to look, with attention rather than expectation. Among the ordinary ferns and wood sorrel and the small violets that grew in the damp shade, she saw a plant she did not recognize. Low-growing, with leaves of an unusual shape, a cluster of small white flowers she did not know. She crouched and looked at it. She took photographs with the phone she now had, a practical concession to the research work. She measured the site with a stake and string. She did not pick it. She did not touch it. She noted the location in her journal. She wrote a description, careful and specific, the way Hartwell had taught her, across 140 years and 1 wooden trunk and 1 winter in a house that $5 had bought. She wrote, unknown species, north slope above east branch of Millstone Creek, June 22nd. Single specimen observed. Flowers white, 5 petals, stamens extended. Leaves, palmate, unusually glossy. Elevation approximately 40 feet above creek bed. North aspect, full shade. No match found in any regional flora consulted. Photograph taken. Dr. Hollister to be contacted. She closed the journal. She sat for a while on the slope in the green summer light, listening to the thrush and the creek and the long, patient sound of a forest that has been here long before anyone arrived to witness it and will be here after everyone is gone. She thought, Eliza Hartwell sat here, right here probably, with her journal and her ink and her extraordinary clear attention, looking at the same light on the same slope, noting the same things that needed noting, trusting that the work was real even when no one was watching. She thought, I am watching now. She thought, that's enough. That's exactly enough. The things Agnes Holloway had owned when she stood on a Concord sidewalk in November had fit in one broken suitcase and a cardboard box. What she had built in Calvert Township could not fit in any container. It was a restored house from 1863, sound and warm and full of light. It was the recovered life's work of a woman named Eliza Hartwell, finally being read by the people it was written for. It was a collection of friendships made in difficulty and therefore as honest as friendships get. It was a relationship with her children, fractured and mending, real in its imperfection. It was a knowledge of herself, the particular and sturdy knowledge that comes not from being told who you are, but from discovering it, alone, in difficult conditions, at an age when most people believe the discovering is finished. She had been called a burden at 72. She had spent a winter in a condemned house, carrying water from a creek and making mortar from clay and ash, sleeping on her coat on a rotten floor, walking 5 miles in the dark 3 mornings a week to earn $15 an hour. She had found the hidden work of a woman the world had forgotten and brought it back into the light. She was 73 years old. She had never been less of a burden and more of a person than she was right now. The $5 house the county had called worthless was a historical landmark. The woman everyone had called worthless was its curator. The work she had done when no one was watching had turned out to matter a great deal. Agnes thought sometimes about what she would say to someone who was standing on their own sidewalk somewhere, holding their own cardboard boxes, hearing their own version of the word burden echo in the cold air. She thought she would say, you do not get to decide whether other people see your value. That is not yours to control. What is yours is what you do in the space that opens up when they fail to see it. What you do with $5 in a condemned house and the absolute cold fact of starting over at 72 in a New Hampshire winter. Sometimes the thing everyone calls worthless is a treasure. Sometimes the person everyone dismisses is exactly the person that something important has been waiting for. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the beginning of the truest life you have ever lived. Agnes Holloway had learned these things not from being told them, but from living them, one cold morning at a time, in a house built in 1863 on a creek road in Calvert Township. She had learned them with her hands. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below what part of Agnes's journey stayed with you. Whether it was the moment she raised that $5 bill, the night she spoke to her children honestly, or the discovery that changed everything. We believe stories like this one matter because they remind us that dignity cannot be taken from a person, only set aside temporarily until they're ready to reclaim it. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.